Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're a few minutes late, but let me introduce myself. I'm Ellen MacKenzie. I chair the Department of Health Policy and Management, where the Injury Center proudly sits. We're very proud of our Injury Center. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome you here today for the 17th annual Daniel J. Raskin Memorial Symposium on Injury Prevention. This lecture was established a number of years ago by Vivian Raskin and the Raskin family in honor of Vivian's son, Danny, who you're going to learn a little bit more about in just a few minutes. But I just want to say that we're incredibly grateful to the Raskin family for their ongoing generosity and support of this lecture. For almost 2 decades, their endowment in Danny's memory has enabled us to feature experts from around the country to discuss and debate some of the most pressing issues in injury prevention, transportation, safety, and occupational safety. We are honored today to have Mrs. Dr. Joan Raskin with us. Dr. Raskin is Danny's aunt, and we're thrilled to have you here, and thank you very, very much for coming. I know Danny would be pleased to see us gathered here all together today to talk about a very pressing and an emerging public health and safety problem, and that is the problem of e-cigarettes. And I personally am looking very much forward to the discussion in the panel and look forward to learn more about e-cigarettes. Before I introduce Sue Baker, who's going to say a few words about Danny, I was asked to make a few announcements, and I almost forgot. But the announcements are that, first of all, there are ladies and men's rooms. So the ladies' room is out this door to your left, and the men's room is out this door to your left. And also, when we get to the point where we have questions and answers, we'd urge we're recording the session, so we would like you to speak into the microphone. So we'll have somebody walking around with microphones, so please wait until the microphone reaches you before asking your question or making your comment. So before we move ahead with a very exciting program, it is my pleasure to introduce Sue Baker. I think most of you in this room probably know Sue, although I'm sure there are some newer students here at the school who may not know Sue. Sue is one of my personal heroines. She has done so much for the field of injury prevention and control. You can hardly begin to describe all the contributions she's made. She's a professor here in the Department of Health Policy and Management and was the founding director of our Center for Injury Prevention and Research, which, again, you'll hear a little bit more about later. But Sue is going to make a few comments about Danny and all the wonderful work he did and how he contributed to this field. Sue?
Thank you very much, Ellen. The symposium today honors Daniel Raskin, who was a top-notch investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board when he was killed as a volunteer firefighter. Prevention of deaths from fire has always been a focus of the work of the Center for Injury Research and Policy. Danny's death was a tragic example of a product safety defect, another area that has always been of great concern to our center. Let me tell you what happened on July 16, 1990. In his role as a lieutenant in the Baltimore County Fire Department, Danny Raskin was trying to get water to a burning barn by connecting a hydrant to a pumper truck. He was turning an L-shaped iron fitting mounted on the front of the fire truck in order to clear a kink in the hose that connected the fitting to the hydrant. But a defective hose coupling exploded, and the 50-pound fitting broke loose, whipped around, and struck Danny in the chest. His helmet flew off as the blow knocked him down and his head smashed on the pavement. After a week in a coma, he died at the Maryland Shock Trauma Center. He was 31 years old. His fellow firefighters held Danny in very high esteem. One of them said, "Dan was a good field investigator for the NTSB he brought us things that he learned on his regular job, and he took things he learned here back to his job. He was a dedicated human factors analyst for the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, where his co-workers really loved this caring, hardworking, humorous investigator. NTSB is the federal agency that investigates transportation disasters and makes recommendations designed to prevent them. The NTSB also plays a role in advocacy, promoting the implementation of its recommendations. On behalf of the Center and the NTSB and the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Andrea Gielen, who is Director of the Center for Injury Research and Policy.
Thank you, Sue. I'd like to echo the thanks and gratitude that we have for the Raskin family for endowing this symposium series. It's been just a wonderful opportunity to bring some of the great minds and thought leaders to our school to talk about pressing issues in injury prevention. Let me just take a quick minute to introduce you to the center. Our center is one of 10 centers for excellence in injury research in the United States, with core funding from the Centers for Disease Control. Our mission is to really close the gap between research and practice to reduce the burden of injuries and violence. And we've been successful in doing that for more than 25 years, thanks to the large group of multidisciplinary faculty, staff, and students who do the work of the Injury Center. And that group, having such a nice multidisciplinary, dedicated group, really allows us to take a comprehensive approach from law and policy interventions, engineering interventions, and educational interventions to solve some of the challenging injury problems that we face today. And against this background, today's challenging problem is e-cigarettes as a consumer product that has hazards of many different kinds. And true to our multidisciplinary approaches, we couldn't address that problem without the expertise and input of our tobacco control faculty. And so we are grateful to the Institute for Global Tobacco Control for being here and co-sponsoring this symposium, which is just going to be, I'm sure, stimulating and excellent and outstanding. So we hope to have a lot of conversation with you. So I will stop talking and turn it over to our wonderful moderator for the panel, Dr. Shannon Frattaroli. Dr. Frattaroli is the Associate Director for Outreach at the Center for Injury Research and Policy. She's an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management with more than 2 decades of experience in injury prevention. She's a public health policy researcher who has devoted much of her career to the issue of consumer products and how they are hazardous and can be helpful in some cases. She specializes in using qualitative research methods to study injury prevention policy and program implementation. So thank you, Dr. Frattaroli, and we'll take it away.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and thank you to all of you for being here today to learn more about this very pressing public health problem. Before introducing our panel, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background as to how we came about this year's topic for the Raskin Lecture. We were talking about this wonderful opportunity for this symposium when I happened to be returning from a trip to Florida. I was down there for a meeting. And on my flight down there, there was a woman across the aisle who was very covertly smoking an e-cigarette. So we're at 35,000 feet, and there is a woman who was smoking in the air. I happened to be in Florida for a fire meeting, so at one of the breaks, I mentioned to the 10 or so people around the table that I had this experience. And the guy across the table from me said, you know, I was on a flight last week when someone's fuel package for their electronic cigarette exploded. And so he was, again, at 35,000 feet with fuel running down his slacks. So this is a problem that we don't know a lot about. After this afternoon, we'll have a lot more information about it. But the extent of potential problems for the e-cigarette boom is something that we all need to be concerned about as public health professionals. And I couldn't be more pleased to introduce to you the panelists that we have together today to talk to us about this issue. There really is no better gathering of people than what we have here today. So first off, we will have Joanna Cohen, Dr. Joanna Cohen, who is an associate professor and who directs our Institute for Global Tobacco Control. Dr. Cohen has trained as an epidemiologist and uses her knowledge of epidemiology and health behavior to inform policy decisions. Our second speaker today is Dr. Larry McKenna, who comes from us. He made the hour and change drive from Emmitsburg today, where he works at the U.S. Fire Administration. He is a physicist who earned his PhD from Harvard a couple years ago, and is a fire program specialist at USFA now, and has done extensive work around batteries and risk, and applies his training as a physicist and years and decades of field experience to inform fire knowledge and fire hazards. We also have today here from Birmingham, Dr. David Schwebel, who is a professor and associate dean for research at the Sciences at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Dr. Schwebel has been a leader in child and adolescent injury prevention research, and he also directs the lab, the UAB Safety Lab, which is a very interesting arm of injury research that brings in the human factor side and really informs a lot of our injury programming through that work. And our final speaker on the panel today is Dr. Josh Sharfstein, who is currently the Secretary of Health and Mental Hygiene here in Maryland. But Dr. Sharfstein has held a number of positions at the federal, state, and local level in this country. He's a pediatrician by training. He was Commissioner of Health in Baltimore City here for a number of years. He was Principal Deputy Commissioner for the Food and Drug Administration. So he brings a variety of perspectives to this topic, and we are excited that he is here as well to round out our panel. So with that, I will ask Joanna Cohen to come up and start us off. If after your remarks, each of the panelists could come and sit down in the front, that will be a great start to our program. Thank you all for being here.
Well, great. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think we only have a few minutes. I'm going to just let you know what I'm going to do and get started. So the nicotine delivery device, or e-cigarette, ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery system, market is quite varied and dynamic. So what I want to do is just give a brief e-cigarette 101 and tell you what these products are. And then I'll go ahead and try and address one of the key public health questions, which is, are these products a scourge, or are they going to be what saves us from the tobacco epidemic? So first, let's see. There we go. So this is just a graph from 1880 to 2010 of showing per capita consumption of different types of tobacco products. It includes cigarettes, cigars, pipe tobacco, chewing tobacco, and snuff. And the purpose of showing this to you is just to sort of highlight that obviously we're at one point in time that there have been lots of different types of tobacco products used over time with different distributions of use, and that since the 1960s, tobacco use has been declining, which is a great thing. So let me go right into the key types of e-cigarettes, and these can be known as e-hookahs or vape pens or personal vaporizers. And basically what they do is they heat a liquid which contains nicotine and produce a vapor. So you're inhaling a nicotine vapor. And so there are different kinds of e-cigarettes. The first one on your left are what we call the cigalikes. They look like cigarettes, and they were made to look like cigarettes so that smokers will want to switch to them. And so that was like the first generation. And we've got now mid-size or pen-style e-cigarettes. You see pictures of them. And also advanced personal vaporizers, which are give more control to the user. They come in many shapes and sizes. And you can also have combinations of the mid-size and the advanced personal vaporizer. So what are the different components? Well, there are different kinds. So generally you have a battery in all of them so far, and we'll hear more about batteries later. But some have an atomizer and a cartridge. So the cartridge contains the liquid and the atomizer heats it up. You can have a battery and a cartomizer, which is a combination of the atomizer and the cartridge. And then we also have ones which have a battery and what people are calling a clearomizer, which is sometimes called tank systems. It's a transparent tank with a tube in the middle. So there are those types of variations as well. There's also variations in terms of the batteries. So generally the cigalikes, the most popular versions, have automatic batteries. So basically it's activated by dragging on the e-cigarette. So it's a switch. When you drag on it, it switches on a battery. It heats the atomizer, vaporizes the liquid. These are particularly vulnerable to leaks, so I think we'll hear more about those shortly. And generally you need a number of primer puffs before you can inhale because you're still heating up the liquid and you don't get enough vapor initially. And then there are the manual batteries where you can actually control the battery, so you can heat things up before you're ready to take your first puff. You can control voltage, resistance, so there's a whole range of products. And then you can think about the products also in terms of their reusability. So you have e-cigarettes that are completely disposable. You buy them, use them, and throw them out. You can have some that have a disposable cartridge, which contains the e-liquid, but a rechargeable battery. So you can keep recharging the battery, but put in new cartridges each time. And then you can also have devices where you can recharge the battery, but you can also refill the cartridge or the cartomizer, whatever you're using. In terms of the e-liquids, basically they have three main components. So there's a bit, and they can have more, but generally three. So you have a base, which is a propylene glycol or a vegetable glycerin base. You have nicotine and you have a flavor. So those are the e-liquids. And the propylene glycol, the vegetable glycerin have different properties. The vegetable one produces more vapor, but not as much of the throat hit that people who are addicted to nicotine are really looking for. So there are pluses and minuses of all of those versions. Okay, so the e-liquids come in a wide range of flavors: fruit, candy, alcohol, and what I just learned that there's even cupcake flavor e-liquids. And there are also a lot of new products, and the big tobacco companies are getting into this as well. So this is a new product by R.J. Reynolds. It's called Views, and they're marketing this as a digital vapor cigarette. So there's actually a processor as part of the device, and it's supposed to give you a perfect puff every time. So this is their digital vapor cigarette. And then Philip Morris is also involved. This is their Marlboro Heat Stick. Now this is interesting because it's actually a tobacco stick. So it's a heat not burned stick, but it's not burning, which is one of the major problems with regular cigarettes. And then there are lots of interesting cases that you can use for your heat stick. Now, people in the public health community who are really excited about these types of products are excited because they don't burn tobacco. You don't light the tobacco on fire, they don't combust, and therefore you don't get a lot of the carcinogens and other bad stuff that comes from burning an organic material. But the question is, are you going to get cigarette smokers, nicotine addicted, to switch to these e-cigarettes. And one of the key questions is, do they deliver the levels of nicotine that regular cigarettes deliver? So this is a slide that shows sort of nicotine plasma levels of nicotine. And the blue line is from the first early e-cigarettes, so it shows that they're not delivering so much nicotine. It takes quite a while. The red line is a newer generation e-cigarette, and it shows that they're getting better at nicotine delivery, but still taking an hour or so to get up to the plasma levels of cigarette smokers. That being said, these products are changing all the time. There's innovation, and consumers are looking for better products. So this is a slide from a method study looking at the effect of a mouthpiece, in this case, of measuring smoking topography on trying to measure nicotine deliveries of e-cigarettes. But basically, what this is showing is that they're getting up to the same plasma nicotine levels as cigarette smokers in around 5 minutes, which is really, so that's what cigarette smokers get. And this idea of a bolus effect, what we call sort of a quick hit of nicotine, is what we believe is very important for addiction. So it looks like the e-cigarettes now are really getting close, some of them, depending on what variety you're using, are really getting close to delivering the nicotine in the way that regular cigarettes do. Okay, oops. Oh, I'm missing one. Unless it got moved. Okay, so there's a lot. So the key in e-cigarettes, or the key promise of e-cigarettes, is that we're going to get cigarette smokers to switch to a less harmful product. They'll still get their drug. It's a type of harm reduction, but they won't be burning it, breathing in all the combustible materials. But the e-cigarette companies have not been advertising them in that way so far, and I'm not seeing my slide of the types of advertising that have been used, but this is another one, and it shows in an airplane, Shannon, that you can use e-cigarettes anywhere, even, and it does look like an airplane where she is. Now, I'll just take this opportunity to mention, and you may have seen it on the Wall of Wonder when you came in, that the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health has just instituted a tobacco-free initiative this past summer. So no forms of tobacco are able to be used on school property, including e-cigarettes. So currently we've got e-cigarettes included in our tobacco-free initiative. Now, I don't have time to get into the fraud of light and low-tar cigarettes, only to tell you that it's a complete fraud. But basically, this type of tagline was really important to keep smokers smoking and not quitting. So considering all I heard, I decided to either smoke or quit or smoke true, and I smoke true. So this was sort of an advertising campaign when the low-tar light cigarettes came out. And what's very interesting is we're seeing something very similar with e-cigarettes. Why quit? Switch to blue. So, so there are a lot of questions about whether these are just promoting what we call dual use, so that people continue with their use of regular cigarettes and using e-cigarettes when they can. And then there are, of course, complicating factors of big tobacco financial interests, and this is a really interesting headline. The tobacco CEOs push the FDA to adopt e-cigarette rules more quickly. So again, if we want to get into it in the discussion, obviously there are very large financial interests that are at stake and playing politics with this, and maybe Dr. Sharfstein will be able to say more too. So the million-dollar question at the moment is, do the benefits outweigh the harms? And we have to sort of break that question into two. Do the benefits outweigh the harms at the individual level? And the answer is probably yes, if a smoker of traditional cigarettes switches completely to electronic cigarettes, the scientific consensus is they will probably be better off. Okay. But the next question is, do the benefits outweigh the harms at the population level? And our Food and Drug Administration now requires a public health standard when they're regulating tobacco products. So when you think about at the population level, if you get, let's say, 10% of smokers switching from their traditional cigarettes to e-cigarettes. That's great. They're doing, there are going to be benefits to those people. But what if 5% of kids start using electronic cigarettes at the same time? And what if they then go on to using regular cigarettes? So these are the things you have to weigh at the population level, the benefits and the harms. And the implications, yeah, this one is tougher. So we don't know the answer to this yet. And the implications are very different depending on whether there's a net benefit or net harm. So if there's a net harm, you want to regulate to discourage use. You want to have higher prices, you want to reduce marketing and promotion, you want to make them harder to get. If there's a net benefit, the opposite is true. You want to regulate to get people to use them. So you might be doing more advertising and promotion, making them cheaper relative to cigarettes, et cetera. So our challenge really now is to design research studies that are timely, that address the question of net benefit and harm at the population level. I think I'll end it there. I'm going to sit here so I can see the slide.
Okay. I'm okay with that. Good afternoon. It's afternoon, right? Somewhere in the world? Actually, I'm lying on a beach in Tahiti watching the sun rise over the Pacific, so I'm having a bit of fun here. So, good to see you all. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about fires and explosions associated with e-cigarettes. Surprise, surprise. This is something different we haven't seen in the tobacco industry. I work at the U.S. Fire Administration, and one of the things we do is we operate the world's largest database on fire incidents and related incidents. Over 85% of the fire departments in the nation report voluntarily to the NFIR system, and we have roughly 22 million incidents a year get reported into the database, about 1 million of which are fires of various sizes. So it's a big country. It's the world's largest database. I got calls from the field that said, these e-cigs are a problem. They started a fire here, they started a fire there, so we started to look at what it was going to be. And the first thing I wanted to do then is turn to the world's largest database on fire incidents. You know, the statisticians, the people operated are 3 doors down from me. I walked in and said, can you help me? And they said, duh. Because it's such a new technology, there's not a field in the database that says e-cig. There's fields for cigarettes, and the people filling out the reports don't know where to put the e-cigs right now. So rather than spend an egregious amount of time required to mine the text fields from tens of millions of data fields, I decided to do a scoping analysis first and look to see what's the nature of this problem. Is there a problem that I need to spend a whole lot of time doing data mining? So I turned to the most reliable source of data we know about, media reports, fully cognizant of all the ramifications and troubles that I was going to encounter in doing so. If you've never been involved in an incident that wound up being reported in the media, you really don't understand how inaccurate media reports tend to be. I'm not knocking folks in the media. They have a really hard job, a lot of time constraints. They've got to put their stuff out there quickly. And what I knew is that oftentimes, from other past work, a lot of their reports contain information that they're not familiar with. The photographs, the videos that they often associate with it for televised media provide information or data that I can mine that the reporter doesn't have a clue is there. So that's what I went to, and what did I find? Between 2009 and 2014, I found 25 separate incidents, about 200 reports, but there was a lot of duplicative reports in the set, of a fire or explosion involving an e-cigarette. There were no deaths associated with those 25 incidents. There were 9 injuries, 2 of which were rather serious burn injuries. The worst that I was familiar with that came in the reports was one that exploded while it was in the user's mouth. The individual lost some teeth, half of his tongue, and a big chunk of his cheek. It was a pretty nasty thing. When we looked at what was going on, tried to figure out what the status was during the explosion, we find the overwhelming majority happened during battery charging. Little light went off. I've done a whole lot of work in batteries when I was at Bell Laboratories in prior life. So I understand batteries and what's going on there, and we'll talk about that. Being from the fire administration, we want to see, is this a real big fire hazard? And for the most part, they self-extinguished or were very easily extinguished. The device would fail and it would rocket typically across the room until it impacted some obstruction and it would fall to the ground. Hit the wall, fall on the ground, the carpet starts to burn. Most of our carpets are flame retardant by law, so we get a good scorch mark, and that's as far as it goes. If it hit the couches or the bedding, or you saw on the opening slide, the vehicle seats, various level flame retardants built into some of those materials and various implications. The recurring theme was they make a loud noise when they fail. So occupants tend to be somewhat close by. So they heard the noise, they heard the bang, they went in and said, oh my goodness, and took care and put the fire out. We did have one that went to what we call in the fire service a room and contents fire, where the whole bedroom caught fire, flashed over, and was pretty nasty. So the conclusions from the data, from the look at the media reports, was these are very rare events statistically. There are tens of millions of these devices out there in the field today. I got 25. Let's say the media failed to or only reported 25% of them. I've got 100 out of tens of millions of devices. It's not a big problem unless you're the one holding it in your hand. The problem here turns out to be the power supply, the lithium-ion polymer battery. It's not the e-cigarette by itself, it's the battery. And the factors that go to that, these batteries are out there in all kinds of products. You've heard about laptop computers catching fire. You've heard about medical instruments, battery-powered catching fire. These reports are out there because they're using the same batteries. And what we have is three general geometries or form factors. The pouch-type battery, which you typically see in automobiles, electric vehicles. Not gasoline-powered vehicles, but the electric vehicles are using a pouch-type battery. You see the cylindrical battery, that's a metal can, or the infamous battery that you all have on the side in your pocket or in your purse now in your cell phone. It's all the same technology. And what happens here is we have two strips of metal, an anode and a cathode, separated by, in this case, the white plastic, in this particular case, a white polypropylene sheet, which is a sponge. And you just wind this up together or flatten it out into flat windings for the flatter shaped batteries. What makes lithium-ion polymer batteries different from all the other batteries that we're used to using is the electrolyte. You have to have a transport medium to let the electrons go from the anode to the cathode and vice versa. And in these batteries, because we're using lithium, we're using a flammable liquid. There's a quarter or a third of an ounce of flammable liquid inside this white polymer separator in all of these batteries. That is the problem. There's a whole lot of smart people working on replacing that flammable liquid because of these problems. But the electrolyte is the problem. You see how they're made. In the batteries that we're looking at, particularly for the e-cigs, they're in a cylindrical can that's sealed at the top very tightly so this electrolyte cannot escape. We know what happens to lithium-ion batteries. It took us a while to figure it out, and we don't understand all the thermal chemistry going on inside of them. But the failure mode is pretty straightforward. We had a short circuit, leads to thermal runaway because where you get electrical flow, you get resistance, it builds heat. The electrolyte starts to heat, starts to boil. Hot things get expanded. It's entrapped in these cases in a metal case. Pressure builds, eventually it ruptures, and it becomes a flaming rocket. That's basically the physics of what's going on here. Placing the cylindrical battery inside a cylindrical device amplifies, actually creates a nozzle. In the rocketry world, we have a fuel burns and we send the fuel, the product of combustion through a nozzle to form and create the thrust. In this case, the plastic cylinder that we make the e-cig out of is our nozzle. So it's just a perfect culmination of something that goes flash bang in the night and a nozzle to send it flying. In the case, in the lower right-hand corner, you see it flew from the front of the car, impacted the back seat, and started the back seat on fire. There was also an incident where it flew to the back seat and landed in the baby's car seat. Not a particular thing. Our problem here is predominantly the low-end E6. The bigger ones, the bigger units that produce these huge clouds of vapor that the proponents are liking, using a different battery that generally requires me to take the battery out of the device and plug it into a charger. The lithium-ion batteries have safety circuits built in to prevent the thermal runaway in the battery sometimes, not all of them. The lower-end ones do not. In high-end things, they've got in the battery, the charger also, and sometimes in the device. You look at your USB port, how many are labeled like this? And if you have a device that's labeled for a 1 amp charging current, and you plug it into an unlabeled port with the 2 amps or 3 amps or even up as much as 5 amps of current, bad things happen. And that's what we're doing. Let me just show you, I'll show you a quick video here. Here's the conclusions here. It doesn't happen very often. As we get more of these things, we'll see more incidents unless we can control the battery problem. Again, is it a big problem? Probably not, unless you're the one that's holding it in your mouth when it goes. Very few of them go in your mouth. I did conclude that if we did away with the USB charging connections, it'll make it much harder for consumers who don't understand the physics of what's going on in a battery to overcharge the device. Because if you have a special, you force them to do that. Now, what I'm going to do, we do have a quick video of what this looked like if we intentionally overcharge. That's real time. It's been clamped in place, so it's not going to happen. It's not going to rocket around. But if we do it at slow motion, we overcharge it, and you'll start to see very early on right here some vapors coming out, the overheated vapors coming from the boiling electrolyte. It escapes through leaks or safety relief valves in the head of the battery case. You'll notice it's clamped here. And once it fails, that overheated vapor contacts with air. Remember your fire triangle. In the absence of air inside the battery case, it's not going to burn until it gets out. And so we have, it's ejecting molten metal. These are little bits of the anode cathode foils or the case itself. As well as at this point in time, we have basically what's burning left is some residual electrolyte and then the plastic polymer separator. So this is what happens. It flies, it lands, it ignites something. If you happen to be holding it in your mouth when this happens, it's pretty unpleasant, although that's a fairly rare occurrence because it happens during charging predominantly. But it can happen sitting in an airplane, and it has in flight in an airplane.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to visit Johns Hopkins and see your beautiful school and facilities here. I'm going to talk a bit about the poisoning hazards associated with e-cigarettes, and especially the e-liquids that are used inside the cartridges that you've heard about. So I am obligated by my university to mention that some of the poisoning research I will be talking about is funded by Carr & Carr, a law firm, and I've worked for that entity as an independent consultant. So, poisoning, of course, is a common cause of injury, especially among young children. And so I'm going to be focused here on very young children. And there's a couple of reasons why these children, and we're talking here about ages 12 to 18 months up to about age 4 or 5. Why are they at risk of poisoning? Well, first of all, this is a developmental phase when children have newfound mobility. They're learning to walk, they're learning to explore the world, and in fact, they have a desire to explore the world. To grow, to understand, to change, humans have to explore and have to experiment. And therefore, in this age, when very rapid development is occurring, young children are exploring the world by touching things and by putting things in their mouth. Okay, and those of you who have had children or have worked with children know that this age group, 18 months to about age 3, is a lot of touching, a lot of exploring, a lot of putting things in the mouth. Of course, this increases our risk for poisoning. There's 2 cognitive development factors that I think are particularly important when we start talking about poisoning from household products. First of all is developing categorization. Okay, so you and I can quickly categorize things into That looks like a milk jug. That looks like a juice bottle. That looks like a dangerous pesticide bottle, okay? We have developed prototypes or cognitive categories in our mind. But of course, babies don't have this, and sometime between infancy and, age 5, 10, or 20, we develop these categories, okay? And probably the most active time for this development is between about 12 and 60 months, age 1 to 5. The second important factor is developing symbol recognition. Okay, so you and I can quickly look at a skull and crossbones, and we know that's a symbol of poison. But a 1-year-old has no reason to associate a skull and crossbones with something dangerous. Okay, so somehow children learn this or absorb this knowledge, and that ability to recognize symbols is developing during this time period we'll be discussing. So my research started with this product, and I want you to look at these 4 bottles here. Imagine you're a young child. Of course, you can't read yet, of course. It's hot, you're thirsty. You'd like to pick up one of these bottles and drink it. Would you have any reason, thinking again about categorization skills, to assume that one of these products is safe versus another one? So, bottle A is Welch's white grape juice. I'm sure you've seen it in your local supermarket. Obviously very safe and actually tasty to drink. Bottle C is Mott's apple juice. Similarly, tasty, readily available, and safe to drink. Bottles B and D are a product called torch fuel, citronella torch fuel. It's used in your backyard to keep mosquitoes away. One sip of bottle B or bottle D can kill a child. Okay, and it's happened on many occasions. It actually aspirates in the lungs, which is what causes the death. But I think we'd all agree that even for an adult, and certainly for a 2-year-old child, these 4 bottles look awful similar. Okay, so I was contacted by this law firm, and they asked me to do some research on this topic, okay, obviously partly for litigation purposes, but also I think very important scientifically for us to understand how children develop and how we might make our products, how we might package our products, how we might label our products to be safer so that children can categorize them as something dangerous rather than as a bottle of apple juice. So we developed a research program. We studied children ages 18 months to 4 years old. We asked them to complete several tasks. They did things like free play with the bottles in the room. We asked them to choose which one they would drink, but I'm going to talk especially today about this second one, which is sorting safe and unsafe bottles into bins. So we laid out about 12 bottles in an empty room, large empty room. We filmed these children through a one-way mirror. There was a researcher in the room, and the researcher said, put the products into 3 bins. The middle one was for toys. That was to help children learn the task and to make sure they understood what they were being asked to do. So they sorted 3 small toys into the middle bin. There were 2 bins on the outside, and these are large plastic bins. One was for drinks, things you can drink. The other was for things that are bad or dangerous. Okay, and those are the words we used for young children to understand, bad or dangerous. Obviously, for adults, we would call that a poison. And here's just a small portion of our results. These data are in press now, actually, a Journal of Pediatric Psychology, so I'm happy to send it to anyone that contacts me. But to give you some sense, this is the percent of children who sorted the products as a drink. Okay, so the child put this bottle into the big bin for drinks. Apple juice, about 80%. Okay, so not 100, that's important, but about 80% chose apple juice as a drink. Roughly the same for white grape juice. Milk, big milk jug, a touch higher. The torch fuel bottle, this one right here, about 70%. Okay, so we see just a very small drop from a bottle of apple juice or white grape juice down to torch fuel. 2 alternative bottles that were placed in the room. This one here we call our alternative black bottle. This is actually the same bottle. The same bottle, we painted it black. We actually swished black paint on the inside of the bottle, so the outside felt the same. The inside was painted black, and we put this plain black and white label on it with all of the same words. And you see that we dropped to about 42%. Okay, so just by painting the bottle black and putting a plain label on, we dropped from 72% or so to 42%. This black can, which is actually a fuel can, I think it contained petroleum products of some sort. The children actually rated that one. Only about 33% of children put this as a drink. Okay, so children were recognizing these black bottles as dangerous more often. They were sorting them as a dangerous product rather than a drink. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to e-cigarettes instead of torch fuel. The official term for these bottles is e-liquid. The slang term that most e-cigarette users call this, e-juice. Okay, so think about that for a second. If you've got a 3-year-old and mom is drinking or using e-juice, you might assume that was safe if you were a 3-year-old, okay? Now look at the various bottles, and I've just chosen 5 that are currently on the market. Okay, look at this one. By the way, no child-resistant caps on any of these. These products do not have child-resistant caps right now. Okay, so you can just screw this off, and children at age 3 have the fine motor skills to unscrew bottle caps. Okay, juice colored in a bottle called e-juice, transparent container. Okay, this one has a bright, this one has a bright orange label, which children might be attracted to. This one has a plainer label, perhaps safer. We don't have the data yet, but I would guess this is safer. These really astound me, okay, and actually Joanna showed some similar pictures. Mom is using a product called e-juice. It's colorful and it's got a picture of apples on it, but it's full of poisonous nicotine. And if a child drank several sips of this, it's toxic. It can kill a young child, okay? This one, we haven't done any empirical study, but if I were guessing, I think this one is going to be our safest option, right? You've now got an opaque bottle, a plain black and white label. We put a child-resistant cap on this, and I think this is clearly, and I'd like to see data, and we've got a grant in to study this, but I think we'd all agree this is going to be a safer choice than this, don't we? So, Torch Fuel is a success story, okay? Thanks probably in small part to my research, in large part to the attorneys I'm working with and some litigation against the manufacturers. This is how it was sold in summer 2012, and before that, this is how the product is currently sold. It's a summer project, of course, and this is how it came out in the summers of 2013 and 14. Is it perfect? Probably not. We've still got a bright colored label, but this bottle is kind of a purplish black. It's clearly opaque. You can't see the juice-colored liquid inside. I think we'd all agree this is an improvement from here to here. So my question, can we achieve the same with e-liquids? Can we move from these sorts of products that we have today to something like this? And I'm certainly not arguing this is the best choice, but I think this is clearly a much better choice than something like this. Thanks to my collaborators and my contact information. Again, I'm happy to send the Torch Fuel paper out if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you so much for the chance to be here. I'm Josh Sharfstein. I do not have slides. So we can turn those off. Do I do that? Okay. Really, really interesting presentation. So my major experience with e-cigarettes so far is when I was at the FDA. And what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of background as to how the FDA has approached e-cigarettes, and then talk about the kinds of considerations that are out there. So the first question that came up with these products was whether they were a drug device or a tobacco product. And it wasn't totally obvious. On the side of drug device, they had a very active pharmaceutical chemical that was obviously being used to affect the structure and function of the body, which is the definition of a drug. And the agency generally regulated them as potential drug devices. And they are, while they're derived from tobacco, it wasn't what people maybe originally thought about with a tobacco product. So you have drug devices being held to one standard in the FDA's statutes, and then you have tobacco products. And the FDA took the position initially that they should be considered drug devices because they're being marketed to affect the structure and function of the body, and a court said no. You have a tobacco law. You should regulate that under the tobacco law. The standard is safe and effective for the intended use. If you're dealing with a drug or device, the standard is appropriate for public health if you're dealing with a tobacco product. So FDA thought about it and decided rather than go on and on in litigation on drug and device, it would just think about doing it as a tobacco product, which raises the question, how do you regulate the products? And what is the right thing for public health? And right now the FDA has proposed what's called a deeming rule, which is the first step towards regulating products that aren't specifically mentioned in the tobacco statute, and they proposed a regulation to claim jurisdiction over electronic cigarettes. So I would like to go back to the first presentation, which I thought was a terrific overview. But what I want to say is I think that there are two really important principles of regulation that are important to understand. At the end, I think the first speaker said, well, you know, are e-cigarettes good? Are they bad? And I think that what a really important principle of regulation is that products themselves are not inherently safe and effective. There's no product that's inherently safe and effective, right? Water. You know, come on, Josh, what could possibly be wrong with water, right? Well, if I marketed water for cancer, and I convinced people that I had Dr. Josh's special cancer cure, and don't go in for chemotherapy but use water, you'd say, you can't do that. That's not safe and effective. There's no product that by itself is inherently safe and effective. It's a really important concept. In fact, what you want to think about, and when you think about regulation, is what is the context you're putting around a product. Now, there's some products that I might say are inherently unsafe, you know, but for something to actually make sense, it has to be in the context of how it's used. And I think the other presentations in the first presentation suggested the ways that you can maximize benefit and minimize risk. Now, since I was involved with e-cigarettes at FDA, I've gotten a few emails and comments on social media from people who are very much advocates for these products. I think, let's just say that restraint is not one of their, over-restraint is not one of their problems in their comments about it. They're very enthusiastic. There are certainly people who believe that the products are inherently safe and are this great thing for the world. And I think anytime anyone says that to you in a regulatory context, you have to be suspicious about anything. Similarly, I think people who say, you know, there's no good that can be had of a product, you know, your initial reaction should be somewhat suspicious also. And I think the question that comes up, or if you're the regulator, you're now at FDA, you're sitting there, you know that the deeming regulation is moving forward, but what are you going to do with it? How do you think about these products in the regulatory context? Well, let me just raise a few things. One would be the assurance of the construction. So you could set guidelines about the fact that, you know, it's built in a certain way to reduce the fire risk. You could set guidelines that if they say it's a certain amount of nicotine, it has to be that amount of nicotine. If there are guidelines that there shouldn't be certain additives, I mean, you could basically set guidelines for construction that could make it better. Second thing is, you could look at certain characteristics. We certainly could articulate potential benefits and potential risks, but that's all they are. There's a lot of people, people throw around potential benefits and potential risks. So what the potential benefits are could help people avoid combustible tobacco products and quit. Potential risks are kids could start using it and move on to combustible products, right? So what are the kinds of regulatory things you think about to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks? I'll give you one that I think, the flavors. I think that for people who are already smoking, for them to move to e-cigarettes, they don't need like a chocolate chip cookie flavor, which is what the flavors are, or brownie, or root beer float, or whatever the flavors are. So I think one of the easier calls for me personally would be to get rid of a lot of those flavors, which I think are maximizing the risk, and in a way particularly that could get children addicted to nicotine. And once you're addicted to nicotine, there isn't anything that quite satisfies like a cigarette. So I would also say the marketing is very important. I think marketing that implies dual use is dangerous because it can keep people from quitting. And I would also say that I don't think this is about the population versus the individual. It's better for the individual to quit. If it's really a classic case of compared to what for public health? Compared to not smoking at all, it's probably not that good an idea because you could go back to using combustible products and there are risks. Compared to smoking a whole lot, it's probably better. So it should be marketed that way. And I think it's totally reasonable as you're thinking about how do you take a product and put it in the context where the benefits are maximized and the risks are minimized, that's how you would do it. I I think I had one more here that I wanted to mention. What did I mean by that? I think that certainly the last point about the way that the liquids are kept would be an obvious one also. So you could sit there and say, okay, here's how we're going to do it, and then we're not just going to make a static decision as a regulatory agency. We're going to monitor certain things. So we're going to make a certain decision about how the liquid should be kept, and we're going to monitor what the poisoning is. We're going to look at the marketing a certain way, and we're going to check to see the perception of kids. So you come up with a reasonable approach to a particular product, and then you check to see whether your assumptions are correct, and then you modify the regulation. So that's how I would hope that FDA would go about this, thinking about the potential benefit and potential risk of a product like this, and putting the product in a position to make an overall difference for individuals and for the population. Let me tell you what I think, finally, last thought, very severe threat to FDA's regulation in this area is some of the emerging litigation around the First Amendment. And if you haven't followed it, there are a number of courts that have been essentially saying that corporations have a lot of the same free speech rights as individuals. And the examples have come up, particularly for tobacco, because the FDA, for example, had struck down its ability to put graphic warning labels on cigarette packs, and that is probably going to go back to the courts. Basically, in this case, imagine if you're an e-cigarette manufacturer and there's a doctor out there who thinks e-cigarettes are the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, you're the agency. You know what structure you want for maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks in the interest of public health. And they say, look, my company wants to be able to market this. I've got a doctor here. Maybe they're even adjunct at some school of public health, who knows, who's willing to say, these are the greatest things since sliced bread. There's no harm anyone can do for this. How can you limit my ability to say a truthful statement? This doctor says he thinks, they should be passed out, whatever, or, to people who are smoking on the street. So if you wind up with essentially the protections under the First Amendment to say anything as long as it's, and I see, Andrea, you're looking at me with disbelief. I was in a room with 400 lawyers or so, maybe too many, 200 lawyers at Yale Law School not too long ago talking about this. The entire conference was about the threats to public health from the First Amendment litigation. Stephen Terrett was there. And it's a very serious threat right now. And the law review articles and the Supreme Court recent decisions affording certain types of commercial speech the highest level of First Amendment protection raises very serious concerns about FDA's ability to do what I would consider to be reasonable regulation for electronic cigarettes. And it's something that typically there's a coterie of lawyers who care about this a lot, but public health really needs to watch this because it has huge implications for a lot of public health rules as well. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to invite you to come up here and take a seat at this table in front behind your placards. And thank you not only for the wonderful content that you provided, but also doing an amazing job with regard to keeping to time. Because of that, we actually have a good bit of time for discussion. So who would like to start us off with some questions or comments for our group? Eileen. And I'm going to ask that you do find a microphone because we are webcasting and or recording this. So maybe.
Thank you all very much.
There we go. Thank you very much. I know absolutely nothing about e-cigarettes, so I have two quick questions. One, are there age regulations for purchasing? And is there any evidence that people are using these as devices for other substances? I'm thinking particularly like hash oil.
Yes and yes. So
even though we heard mostly about federal regulation through the FDA, which hasn't happened yet, but there's a deeming role, states have acted. So a number of states, and Io may be able to give the number, a number of states are acting, and some have implemented age of purchase restrictions. And then I have heard that they're used for other types of, they're a drug delivery device for other types of psychoactive substances.
Hi, thanks again for coming out. It's been a great presentation so far. Has there been any research yet on secondhand exposure to the e-liquid mix?
Say that again, sorry?
Any research so far on secondhand exposure to the nebulizer mist as it's exhaled? Similar to the research that was done in the late 70s and 80s on exposure to secondhand smoke.
Is there any negative effects of the vapor?
I think there has been, but I don't know. I can't quote it.
I can't quote it either. I think it's starting. There's certainly nicotine vapor in the air, and one of the papers I saw recently was the idea of third-hand vapor. So, you know, there's third-hand smoke, which is when you smoke in a room and there's carpets and upholstery and clothes. The smoke gets into it and then gets released over time. So, that, for example, if you go into a hotel room, you can tell that someone had been smoking there. That's the idea of third-hand smoke. So I've seen a study where someone was vaporing an e-cigarette, and then they took wipes around the room, and they were able to find nicotine in the wipes. But I don't think we know anything about health impacts at this point.
I mean, it goes without saying that nicotine is not a risk-free substance. I mean, it may not be as bad as nicotine plus 3,000 unknown chemicals, but nicotine has been associated with some problems as well.
My question was actually about secondhand exposure as well, but a related question is I'm curious what you think about state legislation that's coming out of states like Utah that is incorporating e-cigarettes into their smoke-free legislation and banning the use in public spaces. And I was just curious what you think about that, if that's too soon or a good idea.
I certainly don't think there's any reason that someone should be able to smoke an e-cigarette somewhere where you can't smoke a conventional cigarette. I don't understand why that would be the case. But it's unfortunate that because of the way some of the laws were passed, states have to like revisit the whole thing all over again. I think I don't really understand what the potential benefit is.
I mean, it's fascinating because, you know, I showed one of the ads about smoking in an airplane, that there's promotion saying that, well, these aren't tobacco products, and people, the non-restraint users think, well, this isn't a tobacco product, it doesn't fall under the same rules, and of course I can smoke it indoors because it's not harming anyone. So we're seeing that dynamic happening. But I agree, if the idea is, and we think about context of use, if this is really, if the potential, the health benefit potential of these products are to get smokers of traditional cigarettes to completely switch to a cleaner form of nicotine delivery, there shouldn't be a need to smoke indoors in public places, even if there is a net benefit. So I completely agree.
And I have seen one additional permutation that was really interesting to me, is the no nicotine liquids that are being marketed mostly to youth. So you get that chocolate cookie, brownie, peach fuzz flavor to vape with without the nicotine, and then the whole regulatory burden, it's not a drug, so how can we regulate that use, which is perhaps an introductory.
And I'll just say, actually, so we're seeing that in other countries. So countries like Canada and Australia ban nicotine delivering of e-cigarettes, but not ones without nicotine. So people are actually using, so those are being sold in other countries, and people are using them not for getting their nicotine, but recreationally for maybe getting lovely flavors. So I think the idea of banning flavors, could help with that.
There's been an interesting evolution of the industry, because when it was really kind of starting, it was essentially marketed as this is the way to get people to switch and quit. I mean, that's how the companies portrayed it. It was very much that kind of discussion. And I think with the cigarette manufacturers getting in and some other things, it's really turned into much more of a dual use is much more part of the equation, I think.
I'm over here. Very interesting presentation. I'm a pulmonologist, and I'm on one of the tobacco action committees with the Thoracic Society. And one of the challenges that the medical community confronts is the fact that the public health community is so divided, and there's not really a consensus opinion about the harmful or the helpful aspects of it. There's a clear division, and it's not particularly helpful to have former surgeon generals that are kind of advisors for e-cigarette companies that weigh in. And so this issue of kind of the key opinion leaders having, financial associations with these companies is highly problematic for the public, I think. And apart from that, and I don't think Dr. Sharfstein kind of took the time to kind of go into detail, but I'd like for him to explain if it's very clear that the banning of flavors, which was done with tobacco products before, is an effective way of reducing use among the young kids, then why was it so problematic for the FDA to include that in its proposed policies? It specifically accepted flavors kind of in its proposals. And I wanted you to comment on that. Was it a fear of litigation, a sense that that would be intolerable to the powers that be? That's the first question. The second one is about infants and third-hand exposure. Because if we're going to suggest that e-cigarettes are a harm reduction device, then many women who smoke will actually elect to use these instead of smoking during pregnancy and possibly after pregnancy. And the possible exposure to an infant that's very close to the mother during those kind of early postnatal periods of time would be very, very high. And so the question is, when you kind of touch your infant after you've touched the e-cig or after you've kind of poured the liquid into the canister, are you kind of increasing the risk of inadvertent exposure of infants because of this belief that there's a harm reduction benefit with their use?
I can give my quick rapid-fire answer to all three of those questions. In reverse order, I would say it's a good question. It probably depends on compared to what. I mean, we're obviously very concerned about the effect of cigarettes on children directly and indirectly, prenatal, and then right immediately postnatal. So I think it'd be a very good regulatory question to understand, what's going on. Clinically, you obviously want someone to quit. That's going to be way better. But if the person really, really cannot quit, and this is a potential option, you could imagine a potential role, just like someone in that situation might be given nicotine replacement therapy. So I think that it's a very important consideration that I think regulation should apply to. I wrote comments to the FDA saying I thought that they should ban the flavors right away for e-cigarettes. I think that what they said is that they would do the deeming first and then consider additional regulations. So they're looking at doing it in 2 steps. I don't think that they're saying that they intend to permit forever all the flavors. I think that it's but I think we in our comments said that we thought that they had a very clear legal avenue to ban the flavors and that they should do that. And the legal avenue, if I recall correctly, is that e-cigarettes as a whole are probably illegal under the tobacco law. As soon as they're deemed subject to jurisdiction, none of them were on the market prior to the time when you needed an antecedent device. So they're probably illegal, and if they just said, we're going to enforce that, but we're not going to enforce it for certain types of e-cigarettes, such as the ones with just nicotine flavor, or, that's it. But anything else, we're going to enforce it. So there are ways we think that FDA could enforce a flavor ban, and that was a position that we took with the University of Maryland School of Law's help. To your first point, I promise after I come here in January, I will not consult with an e-cigarette manufacturer. You can put it on tape. I'm not a former Surgeon General, but I just thought, in case you were implying whether I would do that, I'm not going to do that. I think that, but your bigger point is pretty interesting. And my view on this is that the FDA is going to have to show leadership, that regulation could bring people together with a good justification. I think that there's a real lack of understanding of regulation, even in the public health community. And I think that that's driving some of the fierceness of the debate, which I think can be resolved in a lot of ways by smart regulation.
I'm taking advantage of asking another question. Appreciating that occupational health is a focus of the Raskin lecture, I wanted to go back to Dr. Cohen. You started with an observation that we're repainting the curbs around here. Instead of saying smoke-free, they're now tobacco-free. So I'm wondering what the implications are for worksite health, particularly in terms of policies where agencies have adopted smoke-free policies. What steps do they have to take in order to integrate e-cigarettes into those policies, if at all?
Well, it's for work sites and also municipalities and states as well. So, you know, the devil's in the detail of how laws or regulations or policies are written. So we actually had a very supportive dean, and we're able to pass a new initiative at the school and just say e-cigarettes are included, and that was that, with the idea that we would continue to monitor, sort of do the checking in and seeing, you know, potentially if evidence comes to light that would change a decision of whether e-cigarettes should be included, that we will sort of look at that in the future. And then states and cities who have acted a lot. So there are different ways of talking about e-cigarettes. Sometimes they regulate e-cigarettes as a new class of products, and sometimes they bring them in and sort of like the FDA is required to do and talk about them as tobacco products. So anything that applies to tobacco products would also apply to e-cigarettes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment about how effective e-cigarettes have been, or studies that have been conducted to see, to get smokers to switch either to e-cigarettes or to quit smoking altogether.
Well, there are no definitive studies yet, and it's a real challenge because even to do the research, because they're sort of in sort of limbo in terms of what they can do, and they can't make any claims yet. So even though they're not going to be regulated as a drug through the CEDAR branch of FDA, and rather through the Center for Tobacco Products as a tobacco product, if they're going to make claims about reducing exposure to any products or assisting with quitting, that there are certain applications and data that are going to have to be submitted.
Those are upheld by the courts, yeah. And they will be challenged.
It's going to take a long time in this country.
From my perspective, from what I've seen, there's certainly evidence of potential benefit in certain situations and evidence of potential risk. So there's evidence that a large number of youth are starting on them, you know, and then moving on. There's evidence that some people find that they can cut down quite a bit, if not quit, on the conventional cigarettes. So when you have potential benefit and potential risk, that's when regulation makes sense, in my mind.
And I'll just say that, so the UK, for example, is regulating e-cigarettes as a medicine, so as if they were going through our CEDAR branch at FDA. So they can make claims. However, companies or products have to apply to be able to make those claims. It's still quite a long process, and my understanding is only one type of device has gone through that process so far. So I think the UK is further ahead, and we'll keep watching and seeing what happens there and how that influences use and hopefully quitting of conventional cigarettes as well.
I wanted to go back to the initial conversation about these things blowing up on planes, not just because I'm flying next week, but because, what are the airlines doing about that? And have there been any lawsuits? And do you think that's a good way to go to get more attention on that part of the problem with the product?
In response to a couple of rather high-profile incidents on airlines involving laptop computer batteries, in-flight fires, the FAA has ruled that you can use the batteries as carry-on, but it doesn't go in cargo compartments of passenger aircraft. And indeed, the one FedEx incident in '09 in Milwaukee was a carton of the small twists, e-cigs, that ignited shortly before landing in the cargo hold. So it was pretty interesting landing for the chaps on the flight deck. The onboard suppression system operated and controlled the fire, but so the FAA has looked at this. I don't think they understood the batteries that are going into the E6 and the prevalent. These things are just that lithium-ion batteries everywhere, and if you're going to regulate it there, then why not in your cell phone? And it's becoming an elephant that it's already out of the cage, and I don't think they're going to be able to pull it back in.
And I'll just mention, that some of our colleagues at the Institute for Global Tobacco Control have done surveys of flight attendants, and although I don't think we heard about any explosions on planes, many flight attendants were saying that people were using the products and that they had to deal with that as an occupational hazard.
Yeah, I can just say anecdotally, I fly more than I'd like to admit, and I did hear, and I wish I could remember which carrier, but I did hear the flight attendants say no e-cigarettes or cigarettes on a flight within the last few weeks.
Maybe we're almost at time, and I know there are some 1:30 classes. While we still have students here, I'd like to ask the panelists to each comment on how you would encourage students who are interested in this issue to move this field forward, either from a research perspective or from a policy and practice perspective. Give us some advice.
I think this is a great, interesting field for research because a lot is happening out in the world and everybody's racing to catch up. What I would say is it's important to research the inherent characteristics of the different products, but also to do the research about what kinds of changes might maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. Perception, the kinds of things I think that you're doing are really, really interesting, what it would look like in different ways, how people would perceive it, all those things. That data, oftentimes FDA is starved for that kind of data. They get so much data on, in a lab, this is how it responds, and very little on whether a regulation would make sense or not and how people would react to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like any area of new inquiry and new study, the field is wide open. It's a wonderful opportunity for a student to build a long career. I guess I would suggest that you have to think about what do we know in related fields. So my work on e-cigarettes, if it goes forward, is going to be based on the work on torch fuel. And I think we need to think about how we can take what we do know, keep it theory-based. It's so easy to go into just answering questions without coming back to our basic theory. So keep the research theory-based and extend what we know about other areas into the e-cigarette domain.
Yeah, so one of the things I think we can do is be learning from other countries and jurisdictions, states, cities who have acted and seeing what the impacts are. So there's a lot of research that can be done right away to look at sort of policy evaluation. And we have to keep our eye on the most harmful product too, which are the conventional cigarettes, and we can't divert all of our attention to this product without continuing to reduce the harms from regular cigarettes.
One thing I noticed in my ramp up in research on the product was a dearth of information and a lot of competing claims on the safety of the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin that are widely touted as safe because the FDA has approved them for ingestion, not necessarily for inhalation, and then what the different exposure routes would cause. Lots of claims when I went into the vape shops, but no facts.
So you can't pull them out of pulmonary clinics, you can't pull them out of dental medical clinics. And so
Well,
Yeah.
lots of, oh,
I'm sorry, no, just to respond quickly, I agree. I think we need to be thinking about culture, and so often we think about public health in a ethnic minority culture. Here we're talking about a different type of culture, which is the young generation. And the answer is you go to the high schools, you go to the college campuses, you go to the bars and the nightlife areas, and that's where you find your sample and do your clinical, your field research.
well, we're at time. I'd like to end on that inspiring note, that challenge to anybody who's interested in this topic, and we all should be interested in this topic. I'd also like to thank our panelists. Thank you very much. You did a fantastic job of bringing both content and thought-provoking ideas to the forum today. Really appreciate your time and commitment to this issue.